Conversation on race and policing began in response to the police killing of George Floyd on May 25, 2020. In this partnership between CSU San Bernardino and the Brennan Center for Justice, we hope to engage in ongoing discussions related to the history and current context of race, policing, and criminal justice with guests from diverse academic fields and backgrounds.
Good day. My name is Mary Texera, and I am a professor emerita of sociology at Cal State San Bernardino. And we've done almost 120 of these podcasts, webinars, talks as a result of the murder of George Floyd. That's what propelled us to do these talks for the last almost 4 years. So today is not an exception in terms of the quality of guests that we've had. Her name is Professor Lydia Pelot-Hobbs, and she is assistant professor of geography, among other things, at the University of Kentucky. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to, and we'll do a more in-depth introduction to Professor Pelot-Hobbs in just a moment, but right now my colleague is going to give us a land acknowledgement. Michael German.
Thank you, Mary. My name is Mike German. I am a fellow with the Brennan Center for Justice and a former FBI special agent, and here is the CSUSB land acknowledgement. We recognize that the campuses of California State University San Bernardino each sit on an unceded indigenous ancestral homeland. For the San Bernardino, the land of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples, Chemehuevi Nuwu peoples, Serrano Marayam peoples, and the federally recognized land of the Huaviatam of San Manuel Nation. For Palm Desert, the land of the Cahuilla peoples and federally recognized land of the Agua Caliente Band of Coahuila Indians. We recognize that every member of the CSUSB community has benefited and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1965. Consistent with our values of community and diversity, we are responsible for acknowledging and making the university's relationship with Indigenous peoples visible. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold California State University San Bernardino to more accountable needs of the American Indians and Indigenous peoples. The land acknowledgement has been developed by Indigenous peoples with the oversight and approval of tribal elders from these respective tribes to ensure Native American and Indigenous collaboration in higher education. Thank you, and I'll turn it over to Matt.
Hello, everybody. My name is Matt Patino. I am an adjunct instructor of history at Crafton Hills College. I'm also a former police officer with the Rialto Police Department. Today, we are joined by Dr. Lydia Pelot-Hobbs, an assistant professor of geography at the University of Kentucky. Her research is situated within the interdisciplinary fields of carceral geography, racial capitalism, and social movements with a particular focus on the U.S. and Gulf South. She examines how carceral state power is underpinned by and reinforces racist and patriarchal logics about violence and safety, which in turn justifies state disinvestment in public forums of collective care and responsibility during periods of crisis. Central to her research is an ongoing involvement and dialogue of grassroots organizations and social movements. Her first book, Prison Capital, Mass Incarceration and Struggles for Abolition Democracy in Louisiana, was released in 2023. Dr. Pelot-Hobbs notes how periods of crises produce not only intensified carceral geographies, but have dialectically formed spaces of possibility for oppositional politics, social movements, and coalition building in the Black radical tradition. She highlights not only injustices, but also victories that stretch us towards new geographies of freedom in the lineage of abolition democracy. Dr. Pelot-Hobbs will be discussing a portion of her book today, We Deserve Better, Contesting Racialized Sexual and Gender Policing. Dr. Pelot-Hobbs, welcome.
Thank you all. It is such a pleasure to be here with you all today. I was originally supposed to do a version of this event back last spring, and unfortunately I was sick and I had to manage it last minute. So I'm really thankful that I'm able to be here today. And I just want to thank everyone, particularly Jeremy, for helping to organize the series. It's really something special. Many places, many universities started having, events around these kinds of questions of race and policing in the aftermath of the 2020 uprisings following the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, as you all know. But for most institutions, those processes, these events kind of died out relatively quickly. So to have this kind of ongoing conversation, ongoing commitment to thinking about these issues, these ideas, I find to be really inspiring. And I'm so pleased to be able to share it with you all. I also just want to note that I know for many folks, this day after an election is holding a lot of complicated feelings for people. There might be grief or hard feelings, and I am with folks. And I just want to really acknowledge that, coming to a talk, hopefully this is a way of thinking about what might be next, as many of the issues that this talk discusses. I'm going to talk for about probably 35 minutes, and then I'm really excited to hear your thoughts and questions thereafter. So today I will be speaking about the emergence of the grassroots organization BreakOUT, which organized against the criminalization of LGBTQ youth of color, particularly but not only Black trans girls in New Orleans, and their We Deserve Better campaign to think through the centrality of policing racialized gender and sexuality in the contemporary carceral state, and how struggles over everyday criminalization have served as a pivot point for the future of post-Katrina New Orleans. This talk comes out of my first book, which was previously mentioned, Prison Capital, Mass Incarceration and Struggles for Abolition Democracy in Louisiana, which was published by the University of North Carolina Press just under a year ago, late last November. Prison Capital interrogates the consolidation and the contestation of the Louisiana carceral state from the 1970s to the present day. Over 40 years, Louisiana's penal population skyrocketed. In 1970, the state imprisoned 4,196 people in the Louisiana State Penitentiary, commonly referred to as Angola, the Louisiana Correctional Institute for Women, and a handful of work release centers. At the height of the Louisiana carceral state in 2012, the state imprisoned 40,172 people in 12 state prisons, 41 work release centers, and upwards of 80 jails throughout the state, which are referred to as parish jails in Louisiana. Black Louisianians make up 2/3 of the penal population, while being 1/3 of the overall population of Louisiana, and come overwhelmingly from the state's urban cores, most notably New Orleans. For every year between 1998 and 2020, except one, Louisiana held the title of having the highest per capita rate of incarceration in the nation, and thus the world. Through a combination of political, economic, and legal archival research, 33 interviews, and extended ethnographic fieldwork, Prison Capital traces how Louisiana's unprecedented expansion of its capacity to imprison, jail, and police has been shaped by a matrix of political, economic, and social forces. Crises in the legitimacy of the carceral state, global booms and busts of petrocapitalism, national and local economic contractions that mark neoliberalism, racialized and patriarchal moral panics over crime, liberal federal policy and court interventions, as well as the collective activism of incarcerated and criminalized people and their loved ones. Against the exceptionalist notion of Louisiana as out of time and out of place, I contend that Louisiana did not become an epicenter of mass incarceration because it was backwards, but because it was innovative in its incorporation of a range of new punitive technologies into its carceral infrastructure. And when I say carceral infrastructure, my conceptualization refers to the literal building up of new state prisons and parish jails, alongside the passage of draconian sentencing laws and the bulking up of prosecutorial and police power. As the carceral state is, by definition, a modality of the racial state, attention to these infrastructures allows us to understand not only the extraordinary, but the everyday ways that racial hierarchies are mobilized and reified. At the same time, examining the development of mass criminalization through a framework of carceral infrastructure calls attention to the multiple sites and spaces that the Louisiana punishment regime is made and struggled over, reminding us that states are not static, but are multi-scalar, dynamic, and often contradictory assemblages of institutions. The cyclical crises that have marked Louisiana's punishment regime are tethered to the cyclical crises of the Louisiana political economy. At the heart of the rise of the Louisiana carceral state is what I term law and order austerity, an ideological and policy program whereby cuts in the social wage are coupled with punitive investments. During periods of both prosperity and precarity, state officials have repeatedly given prisons, jails, and policing first call on public dollars and cents to contain the structural volatility of petrocapitalism and to ready the ground for new speculative accumulation schemes, such as tourism gentrification projects, through criminalizing populations along lines of race, class, gender, sexuality, and age. Punitive ideologies justify and normalize disinvestments in public forms of collective responsibility and care, exacerbating, in the words of Ruth Wilson Gilmore, the quote, group differentiated vulnerability to premature death that characterizes racism. Or to put it more simply, mass incarceration is built upon the marriage of racial state violence and neoliberal organized abandonment. However, these periods of crisis have produced not only intensified carceral geographies, but have dialectically formed spaces of possibility for oppositional politics, social movement formations, and coalition building in the lineage of abolition democracy. While elite and technocratic reformers have sought to manage carceral crises through slight adjustments to the penal system, grassroots organizers, behind bars and free, have sought to undo the everyday and extraordinary violence of the carceral state. These strategies have included Angola activists challenging life without parole across prison walls, to community organizers building coalitions to shrink the New Orleans City Jail in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, to queer and trans youth of color strategizing to curtail police power. New Orleans organizers, in particular, have explicitly situated their activism in the Southern lineage of transformative organizing against racial slavery and in the lineage of W.E.B. Du Bois's conceptualization of Black Reconstruction as an experiment in abolition democracy, where abolition meant not only the abolition of slavery, but the creation of a society divorced from racial capitalism. This ethos of abolition democracy can be seen in the duality of demands grassroots activists have repeatedly put forth. Repeal draconian sentencing laws and deal with the structural unemployment of Black Louisianians, shrink jails and invest in public mental health care, close youth prisons and transform schools, stop police sexual violence and ensure affordable housing for queer and trans youth of color. Periods of acute crisis create conditions of possibility for carceral state enhancements as well as for scaling back the state's punitive capacities, but neither is a given. In my talk today, I will focus on one such struggle born out of crisis, the We Deserve Better campaign, waged by the member-based grassroots organization BreakOUT from 2011 to 2013 to rein in the discretionary power of the New Orleans Police Department. This talk comes out of the 6th chapter of my book, which really considers what are the various ways in which BreakOUT as an organization contests the criminalization of their very being in the city at a key juncture where the city's tourism economy is being revalorized in the kind of name of rebuilding or remaking a new New Orleans. Through participant observation and oral history interviews with BreakOUT staff and members, I illustrate that the organizing of BreakOUT is animated by a materialist Black trans feminist politics invested in making New Orleans a place where LGBTQ youth of color can, in their words, walk down the street without fear. Founded by primarily Black trans girls who have been entrapped by the New Orleans criminal legal system, I argue that BreakOUT offers an urgent critique of the working of the carceral state under gendered racial capitalism. The We Deserve Better campaign focused on undoing the everyday racial and gender profiling and state-sanctioned sexual violence of the NOPD, highlighting how direct engagement with the state's contradictory nature can be vital grounds for grassroots activism that extends collective life. Now, before jumping into the specific case of BreakOUT, I want to name that the criminalization of LGBTQ youth of color is not unique to New Orleans, but is resonant with other cases of policing, particularly in areas undergoing tourism gentrification. As Christina Hanhart documents, broken windows policing, quote, first tested in Greenwich Village, home to the famed Stonewall riots and one of the world's best known gay enclaves, had this situation where the strategy of broken windows first targeted queer and trans people of color for displacement, was then exported to other areas across the city, particularly other areas marketed for speculative tourism development, most famously Times Square. In particular, police crackdowns on sex work have been critical in securing tourism development projects across the globe. As Erica Williams recounts in her work on Salvador, Brazil, Black women, quote, have a queer relationship to the touristic landscape due to the fact that they are always already seen as sexually deviant. Or in other words, the criminalization and displacement of sex workers of color, real and perceived, is critical for enhancing the spatialized capital accumulation of tourist economies. It is within this context that we should understand the activist struggles of BreakOUT. So BreakOUT was founded in the shadows of the NOPD's post-Katrina crisis of legitimacy. Following the widespread outrage surrounding the racial violence of the New Orleans Police Department against Katrina survivors, community activists pressed the Department of Justice, or the DOJ, to investigate the NOPD's endemic patterns of abuse and misconduct, in the hopes that the DOJ would place the New Orleans Police Department under a federal consent decree and mandate reforms. Over the bulk of 2010, organizations across the city helped to coordinate DOJ listening sessions to put on people's experiences with the police. It is through one of these listening sessions that an informal group of Black, queer, and trans youth would coalesce into the organization BreakOUT. The DOJ's investigation of the NOPD also coincided with the release of the report Locked Up and Out, that charted the experiences of LGBTQ youth in the Louisiana juvenile justice system. The report was spearheaded by youth advocate Wes Ware at the Juvenile Justice Project of Louisiana, where Ware was really focused at working in tandem with the youth behind bars to document their experiences within the youth juvenile justice system, as well as the various kinds of funneling of youth into the penal system who identified as LGBTQ. This report immediately gained much notice, and for many people started to change the conversations of what was at play in the state of Louisiana. Yet by the time the report was released, many of the young people that Ware had worked with on it had come home. Yet once they were back in New Orleans, there was no real political organization to harness their energy. At the same time, Ware was building an organizing relationship with Milan Nicole Cherie, a young Black trans woman who was interning at the Juvenile Justice Project of Louisiana. When they heard that Women with a Vision, a long-standing Black feminist organization, was coordinating DOJ listening sessions on LGBTQ people's experiences with the NOPD, Cherie and Ware recruited several of the young Black LGBTQ folks they knew to participate. While such listening sessions typically serve as a performance of concern by the liberal state, the young people in attendance flipped the script, moving beyond the notion that the DOJ could or would save them and remaking the space to their own ends. They seamlessly transitioned from testifying about the NOPD's everyday violence to envisioning solutions. Ware recalls, quote, they quickly started talking about what they would like to see, what the possibilities were, and what the DOJ should do. I remember scrambling for chart paper and putting it up on the wall and just writing down all the things young folks were saying about we should do this or that. The city should be spending its money this way and not that way. The DOJ representative just had to sit there while people just started running with these ideas. That was the first BreakOUT meeting. But these conversations and visioning did not end with that single listening session. An initial group of 6 youth, Milan Nicole Cherie, Kenesha Harris, London Palmer, Amari Alexander, Dee Dee Jackson, and Jonathan Willis, began meeting together weekly with staffing support from Ware as the founding members of BreakOUT. They collectively developed a shared political analysis about the criminalization of Black, queer, and trans youth through Know Your Rights workshops and political education on the history of policing, as well as resistance struggles from the Stonewall riots to the New Orleans Black Panther Party. As founding member London Palmer relates, their coming together was exciting as they had been alienated from mainstream LGBTQ organizations because, quote, they don't focus on the things that impact me and my type of girl that walk the street. They focus more on, it's a cliche to say gay marriage back then, but it was. You're not focused on the things that are really impacting the girls that y'all don't see out in the clubs or that you don't see having a 9 to 5. Let's talk about the things that those girls go through. Instead of being sidelined from what constituted proper gay activism, BreakOUT created space for members to direct their activism based on their own lived experiences. Early on, BreakOUT brainstormed a host of problems confronting their lives rooted in the intertwined systematic oppressions of racism, heterosexism, and transphobia. At the center of their problems was the everyday criminalization of their very existence by the NOPD. As Milan Nicole Cherie explains, quote, "For a lot of us, our experience was that police were profiling us to be sex workers. When you encountered the officers, it was a very traumatizing experience. When you're young, you don't know when the police is taking advantage of you or when they're not. And as far as the power that officers hold could be very intimidating for a person that has no power at all. You will be misgendered and you will not really push back against the police because then that can lead to arrest. As far as police call you out of your name and you correct them, that can lead you to arrest. So it was a lot of misgendering, profiling. Officers were abusing their authority. There were a lot of times where I myself had to perform sexual favors to officers just to avoid arrest." BreakOUT identified the NOPD's power to stop, frisk, and sexually assault trans and queer people of color, particularly Black trans girls, with impunity, under the umbrella of policing sex work as fundamentally activating the cycle of criminalization that ensnared them. Their analysis of the NOPD's violence was anchored in an understanding, to borrow from Emily Hobson, that, quote, "all policing of sexuality, queer or straight, is racialized." As primarily Black LGBTQ young people, the centrality of racism in their police encounters was never a question. Many of BreakOUT's members had family, almost always cisgender and straight Black men, who had been caught up in the criminal legal system. Yet they recognized that the way that they were targeted by law enforcement as young Black trans women and queer people was qualitatively different. They also knew that white LGBTQ youth overwhelmingly did not experience the types of policing that shaped their everyday lives due to the generalized protections of whiteness. The NOPD's policing of Black LGBTQ youth, while resonating with aspects of police abuse based on race, class, and cis masculinity, took a distinct formation at the nexus of anti-Black racism and gender nonconformity. Cops routinely stopped them for being young Black trans women walking down the street, called them homophobic and transphobic slurs, groped them under the guise of determining their so-called real gender, and charged them with falsely identifying themselves when their gender presentation or chosen names did not match the expectations of the official sex and name on their IDs. For them, it was important to expand the notion of stop and frisk to include the sexual assault they experienced at the hands of the police. The NOPD's rampant coercion of Black trans girls into sexual activity under the explicit or implicit threat of arrests simultaneously illustrated how sexual violence could be used to enforce gender norms and fit into the centuries-old pattern of the state's systematic disregard of Black women's sexual autonomy. The NOPD's policing of gender and sexuality served as yet another state racial project directed at disciplining and controlling Black New Orleanians. In addition, BreakOUT's critique of police profiling Black trans girls as sex workers raised attention to how racism and transmisogyny produce their structural class position. BreakOUT members and other young queer and trans people of color often were pushed out of their homes due to familial homophobia and transphobia, and out of the school system due to the intersection of their experiences of transphobic and heterosexist bullying and racist disciplinary targeting. With the already meager Louisiana social safety net further shredded following Hurricane Katrina, almost all resources for homeless youth were through overextended nonprofit agencies that had, at best, mixed politics on LGBTQ issues. With housing costs skyrocketing, finding a safe place to stay was more than a challenge. Moreover, jobs were hard to come by for those without a high school diploma. For those that did graduate high school, the few jobs available amounted to minimum wage work that was almost impossible to survive on. Black trans girls were systematically excluded from the legitimate workforce, which is to say, rendered as surplus labor under gendered racial capitalism. Thus, it should come as no surprise that many, but by no means all, young Black trans women turned to street-based sex work and other criminalized economic survival strategies to make ends meet. While Black trans girls were overrepresented in sex work, their overdetermination as criminalized subjects meant that law enforcement presumed that any and all Black trans girls were sex working. And most, if not all, young Black trans women spent a fair amount of time in the public sphere because of their lack of access to private spaces, which in turn led to more everyday contact with the NOPD. Hence, the political question was not in delineating whether a given girl was innocent or guilty, but in how racial state violence was wielded in the twin projects of sex work and gender policing. BreakOUT's aim to curtail the discretionary power of the NOPD to profile Black trans women as soliciting sex work challenged the logic of criminalizing an entire group of people based on their race and gender for their own systematic exclusion from the post-Katrina political economy. From this political framework developed the We Deserve Better campaign to eradicate the NOPD's gendered policing and state-sanctioned sexual violence. BreakOUT meetings were devoted to grassroots organizing training. Members learned how to map out the political landscape, pinpoint who held the power to make change, identify their allies and their opponents, and to identify the difference between a strategy and a tactic, and how to build power to escalate a campaign. Although they did not think that the DOJ would usher in transformative reform all on its own, they knew that getting the federal investigation to verify the NOPD profiling and sexual harassment of queer youth of color was critical. They charted out how to, quote, organize the DOJ to take a stance against the NOPD's racialized, gendered, and sexual policing through coordinating forums for members to articulate their understandings of the systematic violence of the NOPD to the federal state. In this recognition, BreakOUT identified that because the state is not a singular entity, organizers can leverage one sector of the state against another to undo carceral power, even as activists also identified the state to be a primary arbiter of violence in their lives. Their listening sessions proved to have an impact. The DOJ's report was a blistering indictment of the NOPD's systematic disregard for civil rights and widespread legal violations. According to the report, the NOPD frequently use excessive force and conduct illegal stops, searches, and arrests with impunity, and engage in rampant racial and gender profiling. Moreover, the report discussed how the NOPD targeted LGBTQ people of color and how Black trans women, were routinely profiled as sex workers. While the DOJ had not yet issued their consent decree, for BreakOUT, the inclusion of their stories within this official report was a victory, as it shifted the ideological terrain in their favor. While reining in NOPD violence was important, the overarching goal was never simply to seek better policing procedures, but to, in their terms, quote, starve the beast of the penal system by preventing arrests and thus incarceration. They pushed for a new policy that would clearly delineate that gender identity, expression, and sexual orientation did not constitute reasonable suspicion or probable cause for a police stop, in concert with new policies to restrict police officers' harassment of queer and trans people. While BreakOUT understood that racial and gender violence was baked into the NOPD, they also knew that ignoring state policy and hoping that the carceral state would wither away on its own was fundamentally unrealistic. BreakOUT began researching and brainstorming the ideal policy to reduce the harm of law enforcement. BreakOUT's We Deserve Better campaign was coupled with the creation of a Know Your Rights Guide. While recognizing the state as a primary propeller of violence in their lives and focus on chipping away at the NOPD's discretionary power, they recognized that policy change meant little if people did not know their legal rights or how to advocate for themselves. By repeatedly being harassed by the NOPD and not knowing the scope of their powers, BreakOUT members and countless others normalized their everyday police shakedowns. As Andrea Ritchie describes, quote, gendered and racialized law enforcement violence is rendered simultaneously ordinary and out of the ordinary. Their guide publicized what a police could and could not legally do, what questions to ask and statements to make during a police stop, and how to report police problems to BreakOUT. Along with distributing their guide, they distributed compact mirrors stamped in the BreakOUT logo, which have critical phrases such as, "Am I under arrest?" and "I do not consent to the search," printed on the inside. Even if only as a harm reduction strategy, knowing one's rights and standing against punitive state violence still had the power to disrupt the systematic devaluing of their lives. It was around this time that BreakOUT approached the NOPD with their initial recommendations for LGBTQ reform policies. While they did not expect the NOPD to accept their recommendations, they believed that directly asking them was a first step in escalating their campaign. As expected, the NOPD immediately rejected their policy, but they then made an unexpected offer. They invited BreakOUT to train the NOPD on LGBTQ issues. Hesitant, BreakOUT staff contacted trusted allies about the pros and cons of training the police. Under BreakOUT's decision-making structure, such calls were never staff's alone, but were under the purview of membership. According to Wes Ware, quote, "We came back to membership and said the NOPD want us to train them and asked members how they felt about that. At first, I think some members were excited to tell a police officer what they should and shouldn't be doing. But it wasn't long before in that same meeting, we asked members if training the police would put us in a position of power. And we were able to go back to the foundation we had already laid around our vision and looking strategically at our campaign goals and what we wanted. Pretty quickly, young people articulated that it would not put us in a position of power, and in fact could really hurt the organization and our campaign. Not to mention, we also had young people in the room who were like, hell no, we're not going to go in front of the same people that are bribing and brutalizing us physically and sexually and train them to do it better. No. In working through this tricky political question, BreakOUT came to the consensus that training the NOPD would legitimize their abusive practices and undermine more meaningful policy change. The We Deserve Better campaign received a boost following the Department of Justice reaching a consent decree agreement with the city in July of 2012. At the time, it was one of the most extensive consent decrees ever placed on a municipal police department and the most explicit the DOJ had ever been regarding discriminatory LGBTQ policing practices. Along with mandating that the NOPD be, quote, prohibited from using harassing, intimidating, or derogatory language regarding or toward LGBT individuals. The consent decree stated that, quote, officers shall not construe sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression as reasonable suspicion or probable cause, and that officers, quote, will not subject transgender individuals to more invasive or more frequent procedures. These were seen as wins by BreakOUT, as these dictates directed the city to undo the everyday kinds of punitive practices that had led to disproportionate numbers of LGBTQ people of color to be locked up. Yet the work was not done. The New Orleans city government was required to pass a series of new policing reforms as part of the consent decree process. BreakOUT ramped up their process of finalizing their own proposed policy, which they presented on the record at City Council in the fall of 2012. Along with BreakOUT testifying about the police department's violence against queer and trans youth of color and presenting their policy proposal, representatives from a host of criminal justice, immigrant rights, and feminist and queer organizations came out to support BreakOUT's proposal. Presenting their policy on record at City Hall, rather than in private meetings, was strategic not only for getting their ideas circulating, but insofar as one of their goals was for the NOPD to go on the record that they would meet with BreakOUT before adopting any policy. With the NOPD giving their word that BreakOUT would have the power to comment on any proposed policies, BreakOUT felt confident about their ability to influence the city's LGBTQ policy. But shortly thereafter, the NOPD, backed by then Mayor Mitch Landrieu, began backtracking on their commitments. When New Orleans Mayor Mitch Landrieu realized that it would take millions of dollars to implement all of the reforms of the consent decree, he implored the federal judge overseeing the consent decree to hold off on its execution. When that request was struck down, the NOPD began writing watered-down reform policies that many local activists surmised were aimed at maintaining their discretionary powers and keeping reform costs down. BreakOUT organized their members and allies to demand that the New Orleans Police Department stay true to their word. When they heard the NOPD had sent a proposed policy to the city attorney's office, usually the kind of last step in these processes, BreakOUT wrote a letter to NOPD Superintendent Serpis to remind him of his commitment and asking why they had yet to see this policy. BreakOUT issued a petition urging NOPD Chief Serpis to release the draft policy, which garnered hundreds of signatures in just a few days' time. The NOPD finally agreed to a meeting with BreakOUT where they presented their proposed policy. BreakOUT youth organizer Derwin Wilwright Jr. described it as, quote, just rubbish, and that it doesn't explain a lot of things correctly and was just really vague and brief. BreakOUT brought the draft policy back to membership to read, discuss, and draft feedback. After their collective meeting, they sent the NOPD, along with the DOJ, 5 pages of line edits. BreakOUT asserted that this proposal was unacceptable due to its contradictory and clinical language around gender identity and sexuality, the weakness of the provisions around prohibiting discriminatory policing, and the lack of stipulations around stop and frisk data collection. As the NOPD had stopped 3 of their members without cause in the past week alone, it was clear that a strong policy was necessary. The city moving ahead with lackluster policies without any real community input undermined the entire point of the DOJ investigation and consent decree process. They informed the NOPD that they would be demanding that the law enforcement agency hold public hearings on any proposals. In the words of Milan Nicole Cherie, quote, "You can't make policies about us without us." Breakouts stay true to their word, holding Stop the Frisk, rally against racial and gender profiling on May 9th, 2013 at the NOPD headquarters. They demanded transparency on public hearings on proposed NOPD policies, and interspersed with the chants of, quote, "NOPD, keep your hands off of me, and we deserve better," youth organizers gave speeches about how the city was not taking the problem of policing seriously enough. Milan Cherie explained how Mayor Landrieu's recent statement on policing reforms encapsulated the problem when, quote, "He said he thought racial profiling was wrong, that we should be aggressively pursuing people not because of race, but because of behavior. But we all know that being Black is the behavior. We all know that being transgender is the behavior." In breaking down the false dichotomy between police profiling based on identity and the supposed unbiased policing of criminal activity, BreakOUT pointed to how Mayor Landrieu, and by extension the NOPD, heralding of colorblind and genderblind logics, papered over the centrality of racism and transphobia to policing. When BreakOUT approached the NOPD headquarters to deliver their demands, NOPD officers quickly locked the front door. While the NOPD did not relent in the face of the crowd's chants of "let us in," BreakOUT felt fortified by the widespread support of their demands. A few days after the rally, the NOPD invited BreakOUT to a closed-door meeting about proposed policing reforms. Refusing to be the only ones at the table, BreakOUT convinced the NOPD to allow a number of other criminal justice and immigrant rights organizations to also participate. Through this meeting, they obtained enough of their objectives, including that one's perceived or actual gender identity and sexual orientation did not constitute reasonable suspicion or probable cause, that they decided that the policy was good enough to move forward. After 2 years of organizing, the city formally authorized Policy 402, the NOPD's LGBTQ policy, in June of 2013. BreakOUT celebrated the announcement as a victory that could be leveraged for future struggles. Yet, as one youth organizer articulated, quote, "We recognize that much more must be done to ensure the safety of queer and trans youth of color on the streets of New Orleans." To get the word out about Policy 402, BreakOUT updated their street safety guide, and members coordinated a photo shoot seen here to publicize Policy 402 and other legal information through a widespread social media campaign. A year after the win of Policy 402, BreakOUT released, quote, "We Deserve Better, a report on policing in New Orleans by and for queer and trans youth of color." While the bulk of the report focused on sharing the survey data and testimonials BreakOUT members and staff collected, which further affirmed their assertions about law enforcement's targeting of queer and trans youth of color, it also included a series of recommendations focused on reducing the power of punitive urban governance and growing the city's capacity to meet LGBTQ youth of color's material needs. BreakOUT noted that while Policy 402 is a great start, there was still work to be done to fully implement the consent decree, better policies for police cameras, the NOPD ending its collusion with ICE, and the NOPD acknowledging the harm they had done to New Orleanians. BreakOUT asserted that the NOPD consent decree was already being undercut by Landrieu, inviting 100 state troopers to bulk up policing in the French Quarter after a high-profile shooting. They demanded that the state police be removed from the French Quarter, not only because more law enforcement generally increased people's vulnerability to arrests, but also because the state troopers were outside the bounds of the DOJ consent decree. They also argued for the repeal of a new state criminal law that further criminalized solicitation and was explicitly targeted at sex workers and homeless people. Furthermore, they argued that money should be shifted from more police to providing more housing opportunities for youth in our city, and proposed that the city should not only develop a job training program, but actively facilitate youth in obtaining living wage work. In conclusion, BreakOUT's We Deserve Better campaign successfully pushed the Department of Justice and city government officials to officially recognize the NOPD's targeted harassment of queer and trans youth of color, and pressured the NOPD to adopt Policy 402 to curtail their ability to stop, frisk, sexually assault, and arrest LGBTQ people with abandon. Through a multi-pronged organizing strategy, BreakOUT leveraged federal interventions to disrupt the normalization of the NOPD's racialized and gendered profiling and sexual violence, and to achieve concrete wins that lessened the scope and power of New Orleans' carceral infrastructure. In doing so, they refuted the carceral logics that rendered Black transness and queerness as always already criminal, in tandem with affirming the value of Black LGBTQ life in a city that renders such life disposable to the imperatives of gender racial capitalism. They disavowed the notion that their safety was located in heightened policing and contended that true security would come from meaningful investments in the social infrastructures that they had been structurally excluded from. At the core of their work was not only BreakOUT demanding the right to a place in the new New Orleans, but a fundamental restructuring of the city's priorities, capacities. As BreakOUT organizer Derwin Willwright Jr. explained, the work of We Deserve Better was fundamentally about working towards a society that did not equate police with safety. Quote, I want a world with community accountability where we aren't relying on the police. As Black and brown people and LGBTQ people, the police have never really done anything for us except stop our youth and tear our families apart. I would like to see a day when the NOPD is not who we rely on, but instead ensure that we can hold each other accountable in communities without using violence or guns. Or in other words, that true safety and freedom comes from replacing everyday racial, gender, and sexual criminalization with life-furthering practices and policies rooted in ethos of collective care and freedom. Thank you. Let's stop sharing now.
Thank you, Lydia. Thank you. I hope my colleague Michael will monitor the questions in the chat. In the meantime, I've got about 20 questions. No, I don't want to scare you, but I'm just wondering if you could give us a little bit better idea of the extent of your participation with these groups. Would you consider yourself an observer, a participant, or a participant observer?
Yeah, I think I would think of myself as a participant observer. So I'm a geographer by training, which means that I, both engage in deep archival work in my methods, but I do a lot of qualitative research as well. And part of my ethnographic practice, I lived in New Orleans for several years before starting this project initially as my dissertation. So I had pre-existing relationships with many of the folks in BreakOUT. And when I initially had the idea that I wanted to write about what they were doing, that I thought that there was something going on that was worth noting. I had a series of meetings with BreakOUT's leadership structure. We made community agreements about what was on the table, what wasn't on the table. They got to look at drafts of my writing, give me feedback, and I also committed to sharing research early on that might be useful for their campaigns. So over about 2 years, I did what I think is a pretty typical participant observation relationship where I gave members rides to meetings. I showed up to do paperwork in the office. I sometimes facilitated workshops and did political education with members. I attended events. I actually copy edited that last report that you just saw that they put together in 2013. They asked me to do that. Sometimes I wrote grants for them. So I was very much part of this conversation and trying mostly to kind of support their work as much as possible in exchange for the really, I think, enormous gift that any academic receives, which is a community engaged organization allowing you to write about the work that they're doing, right? Because fortunately, so many academics don't have a often extractive relationship to this work. So this was part of the story. So I would say it was a mixture of participant observation.
I've got one sort of follow-up. I'm just wondering if the women who were in these organizations, if they ever gave up hope, or did they soldier on regardless of the setbacks? Because I know from my work and others' work that NOPD is a hard nut to crack. It is a very, very, they're low paid, low education, and can be really notorious at times. So how did the women feel?
They really were incredibly, there was a lot of joy in the process. I think the coming together, right? And many of these young women had like informal relationships, but it was always notable to me, right? You would go to the BreakOUT office or you would be at an event and the amount of kind of joy, and you could feel this feeling of collective power that folks really had in this moment. And I think that it really, to me at least, spoke to the ways in which when folks come together, right, they really see themselves as something bigger than themselves. And I think particularly doing that kind of political education work where they were able to say, oh, it wasn't just, I haven't just had this experience with the police, or or just you. They were like, oh, we're all having pretty identical experiences. Because I think there was also a lot of shame and stigma initially about what they were experiencing, right? And so having the opportunity to put it into a political landscape and to find others to fight back, I think was a really empowering experience for these folks. But lots of joy. Like, I really cannot express how much joy there were in these spaces. Mm-hmm.
Michael, any questions?
Sure. Oh, obviously, we've just come through another election, and to a significant extent, the Trump Vance campaign centralized anti-trans rhetoric.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think we can anticipate from a new Trump administration, and how much of the previous Trump administration educates us on what's to come?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I mean, I think that it's also, for me, on one hand, right, the kind of transphobic moral panics that we're really experiencing right now in the US are, really outrageous, right? And they've said pretty explicitly, right, the kind of targeting of gender affirming care on minors, even with parental consent, right? They've been really explicit that that is part of a broader strategy of trying to target it for everyone, right? Even in, I think it was in Oklahoma, first the laws, they did not get these laws passed. They got laws passed that banned it for people under 18, but they also put in bills in that moment for 21 and under, 25 and under, right? They're really kind of expanding this capacious idea of what constitutes youth, despite the fact that, the American Medical Association, all the people who are, in that field of experts say that there's, incredibly low rates of AIDS happening whatsoever. And B, when it happens, there's not high rates of what's regret, right? That the regret level are much lower than many other kinds of health things. So I think we're going to see that. I guess my question is, because so much of these powers are happening at the state level, what the federal government, where it intervenes and not, right? You all are in California, so I imagine there are certain kinds of protections, in contrast to a place like Kentucky, where I think that where I am, which I think allows for the legislature to kind of move forward as fast as possible with kind of a green light feeling from the federal government, because there aren't the kinds of potential blockages that the federal government might otherwise put in. So I think it's also going to license things at the state level, both in terms of healthcare, in terms of education, and don't say gay bills or don't talk about gender in schools. I mean, all these things that seem really hard for me to imagine actually doing. But I think that they are going to push that agenda as far as they can go. And I think what a group like BreakOUT really teaches us too is that, like, these anti-trans moral panics are also always tied up in questions of race and class, right? So that everyone is getting, all trans people are getting targeted, but the trans folks that are getting the most kind of heightened targeting, right, are folks who are already kind of having, intersecting oppressions around racism, classism, and what have you. And I think especially with this administration, the kind of xenophobic rhetoric and the anti-immigrant rhetoric, I think we're going to see even more of that, unfortunately.
Thank you. And there's a related question in Q&A, and I would encourage others to ask questions in the Q&A. In this conversation, what do you think the role should be with laws against sex trafficking and prostitution of minors?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, this was also during an era, and I write about this in the chapter, where there was a real uptick in federal law enforcement around kind of sex trafficking. And this is under the Obama administration. So under the Obama administration, there was kind of new, under the Department of Homeland Security, there were kind of new anti-sex trafficking laws that were put into place, and more kind of aggressive campaigns. And while obviously, I think absolutely no one would disagree with the assertion that sex trafficking is bad, any kind of labor exploitation is bad, right? Forced labor is bad. One of the things that BreakOUT members really experienced at this time was it was allowing for more heightened policing of themselves, right? Because there became this collusion of sex work and sex trafficking. And that, for instance, when the Super Bowl was in New Orleans in 2013, there was all these new kinds of both state and federal law enforcement that were in the city under the kind of narrative that was circulating at the time that mega events are the greatest epicenters for sex trafficking. We don't actually have evidence, but every time there's a mega event, that narrative comes up really intensely. And what happened in that moment was that the local law enforcement really cracked down intensely on anyone they thought might be sex working. So anyone they saw walking down the street who was a young woman in maybe a more revealing outfit, or who were trans, or who, had particular, class backgrounds, and in particular neighborhoods, in particular French Quarter. So there was this real uptick in arrests, right? And there were also a lot of stings that happened against sex workers in New Orleans, leading to, I believe, if I get this number right, something about 80-something people got arrested in one sting. And after the sting was over, they found that absolutely no one was involved in sex trafficking. They were engaged in sex work. They were all of age, right? So I think for me, it's always the question of how certain stories circulate, and then they allow for the entrapment of other people, right? And then, it has all of these negative repercussions. I know in one instance of one of the women who got arrested in that sting, because she got arrested, she ended up having her child taken away from her for child protective services, right? So there's really these huge long-term consequences, not just for that woman, right, but for her family in all of these different ways. And so for me, I'm always trying to understand what are the kind of narratives and then what's happening on the ground.
I have a question that has to do with context. New Orleans and its justice system, or injustice system, I guess, didn't just drop out of the sky, right? And I think you do chapter 6 is great, but I think you do a really good job of making that link from slavery all the way through the years, and how Louisiana has had its ups and downs through, the boom and bust oil industry. But can you go a little bit into that for our students who may not be aware, and even the name Angola, which is pretty remarkable.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I really appreciate that. So, right, so I'll start with this. So the Louisiana State Penitentiary, Angola, sits on, it's the largest footprint of a state prison in the United States. It is 18,000 acres. It can be hard to imagine what that means. So the way that I always try to communicate to people is that is larger than the island of Manhattan. It is just a bit bigger. So that is how large the actual footprint of the Louisiana State Penitentiary is. About 6,000 people are incarcerated there on any given day. And it sits directly on top of a number of former slave plantations that were bought in the years after slavery or after emancipation. And during the Jim Crow years, it was bought and turned into convict leasing camps. And then the state bought these convict leasing camps and turned it into Louisiana State Penitentiary. The original state prison had been Baton Rouge. And it's in this very kind of remote nook of the state. So it's very hard to get to. It's not, if you look at a map, it doesn't look that hard to get to, but what you might not realize there's no highways directly, right? There's a lot of like gravel roads, and it can be really difficult for people, even though if, say, you got into a helicopter between Baton Rouge or New Orleans, you'd be there in no time. In a car, it's a much more difficult place to be. So this was the only state prison for a very long time. And Louisiana, is a state that the kind of unfreedom of Black people, right through slavery and convict leasing, right, has been a through line, although it has shifted in how it's been made. And I also want to name, there was also a very powerful moment of the Reconstruction state in Louisiana, right? So there are other kinds of histories. But if we speed up to the 20th century, in 1901, the year actually that the Louisiana state government bought the land that would become Angola, the prison, it also struck oil for the first time. So these two events happen in 1901. And Louisiana ends up building itself out as an oil state, where so much of its state revenue, so in other words, so much of the taxes it's able to accrue come from the oil industry, and then later also the natural gas industry. This really puts it kind of up over the years. And by the early 1970s, Louisiana finds itself in this really unique position, because in 1973, the kind of global states that organize a lot of the kind of oil of the world, the OPEC nation states, first kind of raised the prices on oil in response to kind of low amounts of revenue they had been getting through British and American oil companies. And then they also set an embargo in response to President Nixon's policies in the Middle East. In this instant, there's a kind of massive oil prices go through the roof. For most of the US, this spurs on a recession. But Louisiana, where the state is an oil state, all of a sudden it has more money than it knows what to do with. I mean, this is a very nerdy thing. I read decades of state budgets, and every state budget would go, we had more money than we thought, by millions and millions and millions of dollars, like for years in a row. And it's during this moment that there are lawsuits about kind of abhorrent conditions, racial segregation, toxic living conditions, so many abusive practices happening at the Louisiana State Penitentiary, that these oil revenues come to be used to reform the prison. And while this seems good on the first thing, like people should not have these toxic living conditions, what it actually does is it expands out not only the Louisiana State Penitentiary, but it also leads to the building out of new prisons across the state, when the various constitutional complaints, at the time they also talked about using to have greater early release or smaller urban rehabilitative prisons or other kinds of dynamics. And so there's this way in which, many other states, California included, had similar conditions of confinements lawsuits with the Department of Corrections in the 70s and 80s. But Louisiana, unlike any of these other states, starts the building process about a decade earlier, right? So because it has this money on hand that other places just don't have. And increasingly, right, you see predominantly Black men getting incarcerated and doing life sentences, right? So you see not just the number of people getting locked up growing, but the amount of time they're doing also growing, from being a couple of years to all of a sudden sentences of 20, 30, 40 natural life. And so it has all of these different impacts. So I could get into more of the weeds, but I'm going to pause for now so I don't go too much there. Thank you for that question. It's great.
Michael, anything? You're on mute.
We don't have any more questions in the chat. So again, I just encourage the audience to ask questions through the chat. But where is your research going now?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this book came out about a year ago, and that was about a 10-year project. So I have this hunch that this next project that's in the very early stages will be about another 10-year project, if I'm being realistic about how much time all these things take. So coming out of these kind of questions of actually the relationship of oil capitalism in prisons, and also a couple of the chapters of the book really square in on Hurricane Katrina, is I'm interested in doing a multi-sided study of carceral and anti-carceral responses to climate change, specifically related to hurricanes, and the three kind of areas of the country most vulnerable, although many places are increasingly vulnerable, but the most officially vulnerable to hurricanes, which is South Louisiana, New Orleans, South Florida, and Miami, and then actually San Juan, Puerto Rico, because San Juan, because of its colonial relationship, is also under U.S. disaster jurisdiction. So I've started to do some early both research into the history of FEMA and the pre-existing entities pre-FEMA, what happened after September 11th when FEMA was moved into the Department of Homeland Security, and some of its more recent collaborations with ICE. And then also thinking about what are the different ways that community activists have been imagining what are other kind of both long-term as well as immediate needs for folks in the times of disasters. But it's a very early process. So, I have more questions than answers.
Yeah, we'll look forward to that over the next decade. Hopefully we can be encouraging. There is another question in the chat now. There's been a fantastic this has been a fantastic presentation. Thank you for being here and doing the work. Can you speak to the idea of the very small trans population being used for scapegoatism to distract the citizenry? Do you believe this has an impact on the incarceration and police focus on the trans population?
Yeah, it's a great question. It is not that large, right? I think this is also part of it, right? It's bigger in that people are coming to have more capacity to identify, right, with a range of their own gender expressions for all kinds of good reasons. But I think no one would claim that like most people in the US are trans, obviously. But with that said, I think there's a very long history, right, of kind of trans policing or policing of trans or gender nonconforming people, right? And so I guess I keep having this question of like, in there's been so much great research about how, as late as in the 40s and 50s and 60s in New York, right, cops would bust up bars, gay and lesbian bars, and if you were wearing the wrong items of clothing, so if you were a man wearing too many pieces of women's clothing or vice versa, right, you could get hauled away, right? So the question I keep having is, okay, we're not in that moment, but that was a very, very dominant moment for an extraordinarily long time of people living kind of hidden or, parallel lives. But I think what's different now is that since the era of mass incarceration, right, the state's capacity to criminalize has actually expanded, right? So it's not just that these police officers might kind of rough people up, but I'm very, thinking about what this means in terms of, looking into medical records, right? Or looking into other kinds of, school surveillance, right? I mean, I have colleagues at the University of Florida who are very careful about what they do and do not say in their classrooms because their students are allowed to record what they say and if they get reported, right? Which is a very terrifying thing to imagine, but it's true. And so I think that there is this way that trans folks are kind of being scapegoated for sure at this moment, and that anything that is kind of outside of a kind of white masculinist Christian idea of who constitutes as an American, right, is being seen as a threat at this moment in time. And so I think we're going to keep seeing, unfortunately, all kinds of different policing and criminalization. But I also think, the amount of bills that have been passed in just the last 3 years have, like, every year of the last 3 years has preceded the number of anti-trans bills ever passed. So we're also like, what is this tipping point? And also, and I really want to emphasize this, right? There has been incredible organizing that folks have been doing all across this country, right? Up against these kinds of things and trying to push back. Both LGBTQ folks, but also, all kinds of folks who just see this as like a really kind of negative and harmful way to respond to anyone's humanity. So I think that's also part of the story as well.
Couple of things as we let you go. You
Mhm.
have been more than generous with your time. I agree with the member of the audience who praised you for your presentation today. It was wonderful, and it wouldn't surprise me that you have recruited some new geographers, because that's a major that is very small in our college. But I suspect, now that you have shown them the possibilities of geography, that is going to, I think, change some majors maybe. You never know, because you're so excited about this work. It's really obvious. So I just want to, on behalf of the panelists, the organizers of these events, I just want to thank you very, very much for your work, and wish you lots of luck in your career. It's a struggle to go from graduate student to full professor, but I think you can do it. I think it's going to be exciting for you.
Great, wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you all so much. It's such a pleasure. And to have this opportunity to think about these issues today of all days, actually, I think for me, it's a very reinvigorating thing to think about.
Great,
So thank you all
great.
so much.
And you have given us hope in spite of our bad news yesterday. I didn't even know if I'd be able to show my face today, but I'm so glad I did. I'm so glad I did. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you all so much. Hope everyone takes care and have a good rest of your day.
Conversation on Race and Policing has been supported by funding from the California State University San Bernardino College of Social and Behavioral Sciences, Fall Library, and the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. Then Lee is our technical consultant. Pamela Crossan provides administrative support, and Alan Yorba provides communication support. There's more information in the show notes, and please join us online at csusb.edu/CORP for upcoming programming, and find our catalog of over 100 past events with guests like Robin D.G. Kelly, Jamal Bowman, and Dorothy Roberts, and many more.